Hey everyone, welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranawati, co-president of ColumbiaDC and a graduate of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. I would like to first welcome Columbia University Club of New Jersey and their members for joining us this evening. We are honored to have Sir Alex Halliday, Director of the Earth Institute, and Maureen Raymo, Interim Director of Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory, with us tonight to discuss the new Columbia University Climate School and its plans to engage the world's future now. Our host will be Andrew Friedman, Deputy Weather Editor of the Washington Post. Please allow me to briefly introduce our panelists, but I do encourage everyone to check our website for their full bios and the full list of their incredible accomplishments. Alex Halliday has been the director of Columbia University's Earth Institute since 2018, after spending more than a decade at the University of Oxford, during which time he was the Dean of Science and Engineering. He's a fellow of the UK's Royal Society and Foreign Associate of the US National Academy of Sciences. His contributions to science and innovation has been recognized with the award of a knighthood in the UK. He's a former vice president of the Royal Society and former president of the Geochemical Society. Maureen Raymo is interim director of Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory, professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences, and the director of the Lamont-Doherty Core Repository. She is a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Geophysical Union, the Geological Society of London, and the Explorers Club. In 2014, she became the first woman to be awarded the Wollaston Medal, which is the Geological Society of London's most senior medal that includes scholars such as Charles Darwin among their list of awardees. And last but not least, our host, Andrew Friedman, is the deputy weather editor at the Washington Post. Before that, he was the science editor at Axios, where he covered everything from climate change and extreme weather to infectious disease outbreaks and the new space race. With that, I stop sharing. Please enable your cameras, and Andrew, it's all yours.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having us. It's a very good time to have a discussion on climate, and it's a pretty exciting to have this initiative to talk about, to have this new climate school to talk about. I graduated from the Climate and Society program back in 2009 when it was under GSAS. It will now be the first program to be brought into the climate school under the Earth Institute. And just in case some folks are not aware of the Climate School Initiative, but basically in July, Lee Bollinger announced the Columbia Climate School is the first new school at the university in more than 2 decades to focus obviously on the cross-cutting massive challenge of climate change. The university brings to it world-class research, both on the science side as well as the policy expertise at the Earth Institute, at the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory, which, if you never went up there as a Columbia student, you know, is this amazing research campus up in Palisades, New York, which is known for studying climate all the way from deep past to projecting future climate, and does really innovative work also on seasonal forecasting and helping developing countries anticipate drought and flood events, for example. The university, through Lamont, they actually also operate a state-of-the-art oceanographic research ship, which is pretty cool. And the climate school is our subject tonight, but more I want to make climate change and some other aspects, some other current events right now gripping us here in DC and elsewhere, topics that we can discuss. But first, a question to you, Alex. You know, I'm curious, I know a bit from what's been emailed to me from the university and from what we've discussed, but for the benefit of the folks here, what is kind of the foundational concept for the climate school, and how does it set Columbia apart from the approach that other universities might be taking right now to this set of problems?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Andrew. It's great to be here and great to be talking to a group of alums like this in DC. And we'll come back to that at the end. But I just wanted to say that I think Columbia's both adventurous and exciting and bold in trying to do something new and different in terms of academia, which is kind of fitting in terms of the way Lee Bollinger has tried to take the institution over the last couple of decades. But actually, in reality, it's hard to think of another way of dealing with this problem. The climate crisis isn't just complicated, it's really, really hard. It's an incredibly difficult problem to solve. And it requires organizations like a powerful university with its scale and immense depth in terms of academic disciplines, with thought leaders who are able to think in profoundly original ways, long and hard, about how to change things going forward, how to transform society, and how we're going to transition to really tackle it. It's the biggest intergenerational human rights issue we face. Therefore, it's a massive thing we should be thinking about with young people. And of course, our universities are full of young people. And there's no vaccine available. It's just like a scale different from what we have with COVID-19. It's going to be with us for much, much longer. And the impacts are going to be far worse, but there's no cure for it. And so we have to get really, really serious about this as a society. And it's great to see the changes that are taking place around that issue going forward. So it requires universities because they've got breadth, because they've got intellectual depth, because given that it's a complicated problem. But it also, universities and academics are typically quite trusted individuals on the scale of things, you know, relative to some other professions. And so people are looking to, for some carefully balanced, thoughtful way of thinking about these issues going forward that isn't surrounded by hype and, you know, best-selling novels or anything, best-selling paperbacks. And instead we actually need, you know, a thoughtful organization. So just quickly, I mean, there are a number of ways you could tackle this problem, but we believe that actually we need to set in place an organization that brings together this incredible, complicated breadth that we need to tackle the problem in this sort of hub and spokes way in which we're developing the climate score. But we also need to be thinking about how this will generate the kinds of new knowledge and new education that are really needed for the future. And in particular with students, it's important to think about what kind of careers there are going to be in the future and how we're going to develop fields that may not be very important right now, but they're going to be hugely important 20 years from now or 10 years from now going forward. So that's it. Sorry, I went on a bit too long.
No, that was great. I liked the oblique reference to other disciplines that may not be trusted as much. I seem to experience that on a daily basis as a journalist covering climate change. But Mo, you recently became the interim director of Lamont. You know, Lamont is this really cool, interdisciplinary, amazing place of deep thinkers, and you're foremost among them. You know, as a researcher and focused on the history of the Earth's climate system, which gives you unique insight onto kind of where we are and where we're going. Can you talk a little bit about your goals for Lamont in the near future, kind of how Lamont fits into the picture of the climate school. And then I think people might like kind of just a little glimpse into your science life. And one question I might have for you, just as a person who gets to ask you a question right now, is what are some of the biggest unanswered questions in your field that you and your colleagues are pursuing right now?
Well, Andrew, thank you. There's a lot of questions there, but I will start by saying I hope there's some Lamont and D's alumni in the audience. If there are, it's great that you're here. I am so honored to be the interim director of Lamont, and it's a place where I've spent a big chunk of my life as a grad student, and then the last 10 years back as a scientist. So as Alex said, the climate school is going to span many disciplines and many areas of scholarship and inquiry. But the earth sciences truly, you know, has never been more important to humanity than they are right now. I mean, we really are kind of the scientific core of understanding climate change and understanding what's happening around the world. And these challenges go from extreme weather events to heat emergencies to wildfires, hurricanes, hurricane damage, crops, water security. It's all part of the geosciences, the earth sciences, and they're all demanding that we better understand what's happening now, how things are going to change, and what solutions we can put in place. And these are really huge challenges for Lamont, but we also have, at the same time, an incredible amount of new tools that are just like coming on board, and we're deploying. These include increasing satellite arrays, drones, sensors that are autonomous, that are sending back a flood of new data. We also have new techniques that we're using to analyze data and to build better models to predict things using tools like machine learning and artificial intelligence. It's very exciting. And so there's a lot going on. We just went through at Lamont a strategic planning process, visioning what are our research goals for the next 10 years. We've identified 10 research priority areas that I will do my best to support and drive forward. I won't tell you what all 10 of them are, but just to give you a flavor of them, one, for instance, is anticipating earthquakes. This is very much grounded in the earth sciences, but we are becoming increasingly adept at possibly predicting and anticipating earthquakes. Climate and extreme weather is another one of the areas that we're doing groundbreaking research at the forefront of. We have a long history of studying Earth's natural climate variability in the past, critical for providing the context and understanding what's happening now. We have large groups of scientists studying geohealth, the public dimensions of pollution, air, soil, water, ocean pollution. And then the last topic I'll mention that's close to my heart is studying sea level and coastal resiliency. And of course, this is an ongoing threat that's only increasing in magnitude as the polar ice sheets continue to warm and melt. So these are all areas with plus more where Lamont's really focusing our intellectual firepower, let's say.
Awesome. And in terms of your field, what is driving you forward in terms of your research and some of the unanswered questions that you're looking at, even just personally? Just because I think, you know, scientists are incredibly interesting people. As somebody who covers the sciences, it's just, I'm just curious.
So my research group has really focused on sea level change in the last 10 years. And we've looked at it from the question of, so right now the polar regions are warming, and in Antarctica especially, parts of Antarctica are melting dramatically, but other parts of Antarctica are gaining mass because as it warms in Antarctica, there's actually places where there's more snowfall as it gets warmer, which is a little counterintuitive, but we do call it a polar desert down there. So one of the things that has been very uncertain is what would be the net effect of a little bit of warming in Antarctica. Would the snowfall outweigh the melting in other places? Because the whole continent's like the size of North America. And so one of the ways we can get at this question is to look at how climate and sea level changed in the past. And so we could go to past warm periods like the last interglacial period or 3 million years ago and say, okay, it was 2 degrees warmer than pre-industrial at this time, which is obviously, you know, a level of warming that will soon be upon us. And we can ask, how high was sea level at that time? And that can tell us, did sea level rise by 2 meters, 4 meters, 10 meters when the ice sheets came to equilibrium with that degree of warming? And so when we started down this path, it was kind of a rabbit hole. We thought it would be easier than it was. We discovered all kinds of things about how the geologic record records sea level in the past. We discovered places were moving that geoscientists didn't think moved. And so they deflected our paleo shorelines up and down. And it's been really exciting. And I've got, you know, I mean, it just really encapsulates everything I love about being a scientist, a really important, relevant problem where to solve it, you have to go out in the field, collect lots of measurements, bring the data back to the lab, do some more measurements in the lab, and then ultimately work with models to try to understand what's happening. So it's been a great experience, and you know, it's ongoing.
Awesome, thank you. Alex, I guess this is a question for you. You know, this is a program that's near and dear to my heart, but the first program that's being brought under the umbrella here, the first degree granting program under the Earth Institute, is the Climate Society program. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of what this program prepares students to do? And then maybe from there, you can expand a little bit into what you aim to kind of prepare, like the profile of students that might come out of this program in the next couple of years, not necessarily just Climate Society, but the climate school. Because I feel like even when the Climate Society program was created a number of years ago, since then till now, there's entire professions that exist now. There's job titles that exist now that didn't exist before. There's about to be a giant vacuum into the US government of specialists in climate policy, climate science, climate variability, that people that didn't, you know, have this path open to them for a career 20, 30, 40 years ago. So I'm gone on to too long, but I think you get the idea of where I'm going with that question. Take it whichever direction you want.
Sure. So I mean, the Climate Society program it's you know, classic Earth Institute type education program, because it actually brings together people to teach who come from the natural sciences together with those from the social sciences, economics, to some extent, other areas as well. The problem we face with climate change is so complicated because it's fine to have climate modeling telling us what might happen, you know, as best we can figure it out, or using paleoclimate, as Mo said. But then the question is, what do you do about it? And so it's not just good enough to actually understand what will happen. We've got to understand what we're going to do about it. So the Earth Institute and the Climate School and what we're going to be doing in our education programs has to also bring in people from engineering disciplines who clearly understand, and architecture and planning, who understand how to build resilient infrastructure. But then there are other issues like, well, what happens to the economics? What are the financial systems that we need to be thinking about in terms of the climate problem? What are going to be the impacts on certain sectors of the economy? as a result of climate change? What are going to be the impacts on people's lives for communities that are going to be devastated? Or what's going to be the impacts on infrastructure? And how do you think of that from an economic point of view? But also, how do you think about it from a social justice point of view? What are the legal rights of people whose island states are going underwater? Do they have a seat at the United Nations? You know, what do you do with communities that are actually going to have to migrate, you know, not necessarily just within their own country, but to other countries? And there's been strong case made that the Syrian conflict was generated to some extent as a result of food scarcity and food insecurity, driven in part by climate variability and climate change. And so the impacts of climate change on society are going to be massive going forward. And they're not just about the natural sciences, they're also about the social sciences and the issues that we face that are sort of ethical issues, and issues to do with how we're going to treat people from a social justice point of view going forward. And I think the amazing thing about it is that there are communities already around the world, of course, already dealing with these issues. And so as an academic, you tend to typically think of yourself as part of this ivory tower powerhouse, which is full of bright people doing wonderful stuff, and how we're going to educate people with our great discoveries and all the rest of it. But actually, we're going to learn a lot from these various communities around the world about how they've been dealing with things and how how their own societies are being impacted by climate change. So I think a key part of the Climate and Society program, which is going to be built up into something bigger going forward, is that it brings together people, it actually trains people in a combination of natural sciences and these other disciplines. I think, and then there's also a component that we would call practice, where you get out into the world and actually get to see what's happening, and to some extent get to think hard about how one actually can think about climate change in the context of real world applications in communities. So let me just quickly say a little bit more about what we're going to do in the future, rather than just taking the Climate and Society program. So we've got a number of degree programs that we're contemplating. One of the biggest things we want to try and do is to think about those disciplines that don't exist much right now, but which could be really important going forward. And we think that climate law could be really important, climate ethics, climate finance, a number of these subjects, not to mention some of the subjects in the geosciences and engineering that need to be much bigger, like low carbon manufacturing. This is an area, you know, the climate problem isn't going to be dealt with unless we can deal with the amount of CO2 we produce from, and our carbon footprint from manufacturing, or land use, or how it all impacts food security. So these are big, complicated issues, and you have a chance, I think, with our education programs to get people to think about these from the point of view of the future of the planet and the kinds of know-how that we need going forward. And we've, of course, done some research before launching this school to try and get a sense of how popular degree programs in climate might be going forward, but also get some sense of the skill sets that are needed by businesses and other organizations, governments. And it's very, very clear that the landscape is changing extremely fast. And there's a ton of interest out there in terms of student interest, but there's also a ton of interest from the point of view of employers who actually are looking for some kind of this expertise in their portfolio going forward. So that's the kind of thing that we're thinking of doing. There will be without question a major climate school program at a master's level, but we're also looking at other programs that might be more specialized around certain topics that could be offered at the master's level. We're also looking at executive education programs, a number of those which we've already pioneered through Lamont with Alliance Bernstein and others, and expanding that considerably. There's the opportunity to provide education to others beyond executives, like school teachers, who might need a better education in how to educate K through 12, etc. And then lastly, we're looking at the undergraduate side, which, as you know, we have this core curriculum and we have this opportunity to go into specialized fields as part of the undergraduate, parts of undergraduate majors at Columbia. And the idea, of course, is to bring more climate into those programs as well going forward. So there's a lot of stuff that we're thinking about in terms of how does a school really work. But the reason why we're doing this at Columbia, well, there are a number of reasons I can come back to. But one of the reasons we're doing it is because the Earth Institute has already established much of this transdisciplinary way of working. And so we can build upon that in terms of exciting new degree programs going forward.
And Mo, this is a question for you. Can you talk just a little bit about students that you're encountering through, I guess it would be various programs that exist at Columbia, both at the Earth Institute and elsewhere, about what is really motivating them, the questions and focus areas of study that they're most interested in, that you're seeing that might be emerging a little bit, that recent alums or people who have been out of Columbia for longer might benefit from knowing about and sort of tapping into that interest somehow.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think there's been a real sea change in the answer to that question over the last 10 years. And I think in the earth sciences, especially, you know, historically, people would go on a field trip or they'd take intro geology and they'd fall in love with this idea of studying the earth. But now I see more and more of the students that are coming and, you know, reading their entrance essays and all these things, and they're motivated by a passion to help solve the environmental and climate problem. They're very activist oriented, as Alex was just speaking beautifully about the importance of environmental and social justice as part of the climate, you know, part and parcel of the climate problem. They are astutely aware of that. I learned more about that from the junior, you know, that knowledge is going up the academic food chain rather than down the academic food chain. And so, you know, they're passionate, they have a deep curiosity and love for nature, but this level of motivation, I've never seen before. It's all political almost. And it's really inspiring.
Awesome. Inspiring is good. We could all use some inspiration these days, especially. You know, so I guess speaking of stuff, you know, coming from the grassroots level, moving up, I think we've become, just in the past couple of years, so much more aware of the connections between environmental justice, environmental health, global health challenges, global governance, institutional racism, you know, has been a huge focus, especially in the United States over the past year, and the climate challenge. And we have a new administration that's coming in to suddenly faced with a host of very large challenges. But my question, I guess I'll put this to you, Alex, which is, how do you see connections weaving through these challenges? So if you take kind of the COVID-19, the pandemic challenge, social justice and environmental justice writ large, and climate change among them, like, how are you thinking about these things in your head, not as stovepipes, but as ways that kind of flow through each other to get to a better world, essentially?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, interesting question. And of course, a number of people have been highlighting this and thinking about how we are going to get out of the COVID-19 crisis and actually do it, maybe be a bit wiser as a result of it going forward. I mean, there are a number of ways in which one can think about these things as being related. One is that a lot of the problems that we're facing, like this, are going to be felt by communities and individuals who are least responsible for actually causing them, you know, in the first place. And so there's a sort of decoupling between, you know, where the problem starts and who starts it or how it starts, and who's going to be suffering most as a result. And of course, the financial consequences are going to be far worse for people without much in the way of means of looking after themselves and earning a living. So I think there are big social issues around all of these. I think the second thing is that they are all relate to some extent the way humans have been interacting with the environment and the biosphere, and sort of just regarding it as something that they can master and sort of rule. And that, you know, that's been a very common way of thinking. I well remember sort of meeting people in investment banking who basically cared hugely about the biosphere. I thought it was great as long as humans were in charge of it, and we basically got to use them for the biosphere as we wanted to. And now it comes back to bite us that actually we haven't been understanding how important the biosphere is to the future sustainability of the planet and our own lives. And so this whole crisis, there's actually a rather good book just coming out by Ruth de Vries on this, if you want to take a look at it, which actually links a number of these things together. This whole thing is to some extent about trying to understand how one should really work with the environment and work with the biosphere in a way that actually is better for society going forward. And I think the third thing that actually strikes me about these crises is that we have been woefully unprepared for them. And it's kind of like, it wasn't like we weren't told about it. We were told about pandemics for many, many years, that there will be another pandemic. We knew what happened 100 years ago. And we knew that we had to be prepared for it, and a few countries were, and a few countries weren't. And just like 100 years ago, a few countries or states in America decided to ignore the public health warnings and suffered hugely as a result of it, because they didn't want to infringe on their independence and their way of life. Whereas other states and countries were able to respond and actually deal with it more effectively. And I think there's a lot to learn about climate change there as well. But actually certain countries regard it as an infringement on their way of life, and they don't want to limit that in any way. And so I think there are massive issues like that that are actually going to be really important. One of the things that I think is special about the climate crisis is that not only are there going to be a lot of people impacted as a result of climate change in terms of the impact on communities that are going to be see the ravages of climate change going forward, but there are also going to be impacts on communities that currently support the oil and gas and coal industry and other parts of society that fundamentally are benefiting, if you like, economically from what we're doing to worsen the problem. And so to some extent, a key issue for everybody is how do you actually look at the social justice issues there and actually deal with those communities and actually come up with solutions that will actually work for those communities that are going to lose out tremendously as a result of decarbonization, and make them see this as something that is really positive for them and for their families and for their future generations. So I think that's a key part of what has to be done. We all saw what happened with the yellow vests in Paris, where people, unless you actually get the messaging correct of policies related to climate and reducing, putting taxes on fuel or whatever, the whole thing will, bite you back. And one of the good things about the fact that we're in New York, even though it's sort of rather privileged part of the world in some respects, is it actually is quite an interesting mixture of people from different communities, from different backgrounds, from different levels of wealth, all working together in one neighborhood in a place that's been affected by Hurricane Sandy, and is seriously worried about the future, is figuring out how on earth it's going to decarbonize, and yet is being more bold than any other city in the world, pretty much, in terms of its, certainly in America, in terms of its ambitions for decarbonization. And it's also where we've got the business community, business leaders, and a lot of the think tanks and association with the United Nations that give us an opportunity here at Columbia that I think we need to embrace if we're going to really think about the broad reach of climate change adaptation and mitigation going forward.
Thank you. You know, Mo, and this is also for Alex too, in some respects. You know, scientists, journalists, we've been sounding the alarm about climate change, you know, for a long time. And I feel like I have learned a heck of a lot about communication and how communication can backfire, and what the modern communications ecosystem is like right now that we have to contend with. I've learned a lot about maybe what works and doesn't work in terms of communicating science with the public. And I'm curious about any takeaway lessons you've taken from maybe the health community in dealing with the pandemic, or your climate science colleagues from, you know, recent talks or just over the years. I'm curious as to what lessons you've drawn from this experience, because it used to be thought that you'd go from understanding the science to communicating the science to the policymaker to action, but that's not how the interface exactly works for a variety of reasons. And I think for a while we were very focused on the entrenched interests that were gumming up the works there, primarily the oil and gas industry. But that oil and gas industry also employs a heck of a lot of earth scientists, but for good reason. But I'm thinking of now, I think we're confronting what's coming out the works really is the splintering of audiences and, you know, different universes and no common conversation on political matters and even on science. So this is an incredibly long-winded question for you, but really I'm curious as to what takeaway messages you've brought from the past several months or a year, however the heck long I've been in this home office, regarding the pandemic, that you might take to climate change and moving the ball forward, you know, translating science to action.
Yeah. You know, I think this is a little bit like your previous question, in the sense that, like, you know, this year has been a year of reckoning. I mean, 3 major long simmering crises, you know, recognizing that a pandemic will statistically going to happen sooner or later, climate change, been sounding the alarm for decades, anti-racism in our nation has been problematic for decades. And, you know, everything has just come to a head, and it's so challenging for everybody, because these are all problems that challenge your core belief about yourself and ask you to change and think about changing how you live your life. You know, have I been, you know, the recipient of white privilege? You know, should I be consuming less? And, you know, I don't see that scientists, you know, talking about these problems kind of logically for years has changed anything. But I hope, you know, just the pain and suffering that has gone on in this year will bring us all out the other side, hopefully having changed some minds about certain things like the benefit of science and the fact that science was able to develop these multiple vaccines in an extraordinarily fast period. And, you know, if you took that same, you know, commitment of resources and brain power and put it to climate change or any of these huge systemic problems we face, we can solve them. However, that said, I am somewhat cynical about it, and I think that the change will be driven not by our government, but by the special interests, like the business sector and the corporations. And what makes me the most optimistic right now is that I believe that whole sector of global society is seeing that their long-term, I guess, profits and relevance is tied to the health of the planet and cannot be separated from it. And I feel like that recognition is growing rapidly in the business world, and that gives me huge optimism, more than I've had in a long time.
And then to you, Alex, I guess whatever thoughts you had to add to that, but also to pick a question from what Mo just said would be, what makes you the most optimistic right now? What developments are making you the most optimistic about things moving in the right direction?
Well, I think it depends on when we talk. I mean, if you read some bits of the Financial Times, you think, actually, this doesn't look so great right now. And the attitudes certain companies are taking to decarbonization, whereas others, you think, like Mo says, this is fantastic. And they really are taking this all seriously, and shareholders are making their voices heard. Banks are talking about how they're going to invest differently and put their money behind certain organizations and not others. So I think there's a lot of stuff in that side of things that's very, very encouraging. I think one of the things that's been striking about the pandemic is that you had this, you know, this guy who was seen as the face of science, Fauci, who became sort of respected and trusted at a very, very high level. And so despite the fact that people sometimes ignored him and states ignored him, certain states or individual cities or whatever just decided to flaunt. There was a sense that science actually and a careful outlining of the science and the evidence and what to do was actually going to move things in the right direction. And so I think that it was quite striking that when Biden and Harris sort of gave their speeches, science got mentioned so many times as what needs to come back into the dialogue, that people need to be talking about the scientific evidence as, you know, to actually provide us with the right pathway going forward. And it's quite interesting because, I mean, you know, Fauci was operating in an environment where we didn't understand everything. We didn't understand how this virus was actually working. We didn't understand enough about, you know, how it's being transmitted, what was the best way of dealing with it. And at the same time, he was able to maintain the focus on trusting the best scientific evidence at the time to help us find our way forward. So I think there's that I think is tremendously encouraging, that we're moving to a world where science is being revered again, certainly in the United States. But I think the other thing that's really gives me cause for sort of some degree of excitement is the big players in this are going to be, you know, Europe and of course America, United States, China. You know, what are they going to do about climate change? And at some level, we're talking about this tomorrow actually. There's, you know, the Europeans have come up with a pretty powerful Green New Deal effectively for Europe, which actually is getting the whole continent working in the right direction. And you can imagine that with maybe the rebuilding of partnerships around the world that may take place, there will be opportunities for the US in particular to work with Europe that have been lost in the last few years, to actually come up with agreements about what should be done globally to tackle these issues. And then, of course, what will happen with China isn't that clear, but you can see why an alliance between the United States and Europe could be a very powerful way of tackling other parts of the world. So I think there are a number of things that leave you thinking, well, actually, this could actually help. And then lastly, I think the fact is that we do have some immensely encouraging signs from the world of finance and investment, where people are really wanting to see something done. And businesses are actually thinking, rather like Mo said, are thinking seriously about what we're doing to the environment and what kind of a world we're creating. And I think that is going to be important, both from the point of view that people want to live in a just but also more environmentally safe world for their and leave their children with that going forward. But also, I think there's a sense that there may be opportunities to make money and big opportunities to make money out of the new clean tech and the new focus on green energy, etc., going forward. So I think there's a sort of slight sense of optimism around all of that.
Speaking of slight sense of optimism, you know, the Electoral College met today, or didn't meet, collectively met. You know, we have a slightly more officially president-elect. And, you know, when I'm thinking about what's coming up, what's on their agenda, how they're approaching things, they're clearly approaching things by putting climate change at every agency in every capacity. You saw the Treasury Secretary nominee talk about climate change. You have a National Economic Council chair who, what did he do? He helped secure the Paris Climate Agreement in the first place. You have, you know, we will get news this week on Energy Department, EPA, other more traditional environment-related positions. But they're clearly aiming to be as ambitious as possible within the limits that they can operate. And what gives me hope, I guess, as a, you know, I'm a journalist and I call it as, I report what happened. But you can't really be a reporter on climate change without some investment in the issue and recognition of this, of where we are, climatologically speaking, greenhouse gas speaking, emissions trajectory. And, you know, I think the rise of the young people over the past 2 years was the first thing that was noteworthy. Not just, you know, you had Greta on the European side, and you had a wide range of coalitions in the United States and elsewhere working. And they're going to push this administration in ways that this administration is not going to like, but they're going to push them. And that's going to be very interesting to watch politically and science-wise play out, given the limited congressional maneuvering room that the Democrats have. I'm curious, considering the political leadership change that we're about to go through, what your hopes are maybe for one or two things for the Biden administration to potentially do on this issue, knowing that neither of you are necessarily politicians and neither of you are necessarily activists, but you understand these issues and you understand the stakes, and sure, you have opinions and you can state them as your personal opinion, but I'm just curious. This is a very interesting moment to be at, to be discussing climate change. And then after this question, we can go into audience questions following these answers. And in the audience questions, I want to be sure to address the connection between Columbia University in DC and Columbia University in New York, and how best to capitalize on opportunities that the alumni give you here, that the climate school can take advantage of, and vice versa. Because I think a lot of connections, now that the school is being established, a lot of connections need to be made, and will be made quickly. There are so many alums working down here that this is an interesting area to explore, and it's really good to have both of you. So my question, just one or two things on, that you're hoping to see the Biden administration maybe move forward on. And Mo, if you don't feel comfortable saying, hey, I want them to pass a net zero, mandate by 2050, maybe you can say, I want them to invest more in the following scientific funding. Feel free to answer it as much with as much comfort as you feel you can in your professional capacity.
No problem. I'll just start by saying that, well, first, I was remiss before by not mentioning that the student activists give me huge optimism too. I mean, that is literally like, a revolution happening, and I fully support, they know it's their future on the line. What you just said about the Biden pulling his government together, I wasn't paying close enough attention to know all that. But if he is centering climate change in every sector of the federal government, then I am all on board, and I'm thrilled to hear that, because I've always said that the climate change problem is an all hands on deck problem. Everybody needs to engage with it, from individual actions to communities and towns thinking about their, green carbon plan, all the way up through state governments. State governments are some of the most kind of advanced in thinking about climate change right now, and now hopefully the federal government will be getting on board. So I'm really happy to hear what you said. There's so many individual changes that need to happen that talking about one isn't, I can't choose one, but I'm really glad to hear what you just said about what's happening right now in DC.
Yeah, I would just add, I think putting John Kerry up there as the sort of the leader of the climate effectively, and leading the negotiations for the United States, I think makes a very strong statement about how serious this administration is, to have somebody who's a well-respected individual, who's also well known in America, who's known to talk. People know they can talk to this individual, and they know roughly how he operates. He's been involved in great international negotiations in the past, and I think it's a great strength to actually have someone of that capability in that role. But also the fact that he's involved on the national security discussions. He's actually that well placed in terms of the new organization, that the government under Biden sees climate as a national security issue, both globally and also in terms of internal security. And that's not surprising in some ways, because it's been pretty clear that regardless of the last few years, the military in America understood that there was a serious threat from climate change. And they've known about this for a long time, of course. And they're very, very interested in that, and how the planet is changing and what it's going to do in terms of either the practicalities of moving troops around, or whether it's to do with actually the chance of war breaking out in certain regions as a result of food insecurity, etc. So it's kind of like that behind the scenes, many aspects of America have been taking this very, very seriously. And it's brilliant to actually see this now being organized from high up going forward. In terms of the one, if you like, big area of focus that I think the United States and other countries need to really engage with, I think it has to be negative emissions and how to decarbonize, how to get carbon out of the atmosphere. We don't know how to get down to 1.5 degrees, actually, I don't even 2 degrees of warming and keeping it safe to those limits without taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And that's a massively difficult, complicated problem to solve cheaply and at scale. And there's just, you know, we're nowhere near where we need to be with this right now. And this has to be one of the biggest, if you like, Manhattan Project style things that we do, is to get to grips with that and put a ton of money behind the technologies and the companies that are prepared to do that. Because that strikes me, although there are many other things that, you know, we can do, you know, getting sustainable energy, but also thinking about, you know, power points for electric vehicles, whatever it is, decarbonizing the buildings, decarbonizing this, you know, decarbonizing our manufacturing. The fact is, we don't know how to do this at all unless we actually, you know, stay within targets, unless we actually take carbon out of the atmosphere one way or another. There are many other areas as well that need thinking about. The food sector is a massive problem going forward. But I think that's, if you say what one thing would you really want people to focus on, I would say that's probably the top priority.
Nice, thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. So I'll jump in now. My name is Miyako, and I'm the club admin for the DC alumni group here in Washington. And so if you have questions that you've been burning to ask and haven't already typed them in, please type them in. We have about a half hour left to ask questions. So I'll go ahead and get started, and then we'll just see if any more pop up. But I wanted to start, there were a couple of questions that came in specifically about the climate school. So I'm hoping we can kind of pound those out quickly and then get more into climate change more generally. So Megan asks if the climate school programs will be MA degrees, or will there also be MS and PhD options?
There will also be MS and PhD options.
Great.
So we're just getting started, but there will be a lot of different options, yeah.
And we have an engineering school alum, Linda, who asks if the climate school will have any collaboration with the engineering school on areas like energy or carbon capture technology, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, one of the reasons why this school is going to be so different is because there's climate work going on across Columbia University. So we've got Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory, which is like this powerhouse of science. But actually, even though that's one of the reasons why Columbia is the right university to be doing it, there are some other powerhouses scattered around, not on the scale of Lamont. And engineering is one of them. Engineering, people in public health. And we did a survey a year ago when I was doing the climate task force that Mo was on, trying to figure out what we should do. And we went around all the schools, and we realized there was interest in climate across Columbia. If you add up all the researchers and faculty working on climate and related issues of sustainability, it's close to 1,000 people. So this is, you know, without doing anything else, we've got a massive group of people who are experts working on the climate problem. And we've got people in music, we've got people who want to work on psychology and psychological effects of climate change and human mental health. And there are people, of course, working also in areas that are, for example, like sociology and history. Loads of these subjects are really, really interested in climate now. So the whole idea is to bring together a lot of these organizations in what we call this hub and spokes model, the climate school, where the school will have a hub and it'll eventually have a building on Manhattanville, but nonetheless it'll network and support much of this activity going on across the university. And engineering is key. Engineering is it's the best engineering school these days in the whole of the Ivy League. It's got a fantastic opportunity going forward to build out in this area. And we're very keen, and I work very closely with the Dean of Engineering, Mary Boyce, to see what we could do together. And there's some fantastic people we want to recruit to make us even more powerful going forward.
And kind of talking about the other, you know, alumni here that are maybe from other fields but related to climate, we have a SEPA ESP alum, Kathleen Robertson, and she's also a board member. She asks if you could speak to the relationship envisioned with alumni who work in various different climate fields with the climate school.
Yeah, so I think that's a wonderful question. And it's something we haven't, I mean, we've thought about it and we recognize the alums are going to be really important and they're going to help us tremendously. And it's partly because we need your support, and partly, and we value your engagement. But also I think it's quite important for a university. I mean, one of the other things about the climate school that we've thought about is that we need to be deeply immersed in society. And one of the ways you can achieve that is through your alumni network. Whether it's here in DC or in China or wherever, we want to actually take advantage of the fact that we've got people who are connected to what we're doing, who are interested in what we're doing, and who maybe want to engage with us actually around the world. And that's fantastic. We've got the global centers as well. I would say one thing, which I guess we'll talk about in a minute, and that is we need some kind of a bigger presence in Washington, DC. I think it's wonderful that you've got this organization, but I think it's very, very clear that if we're building the climate school, we should be thinking about ways in which we can have more direct interface and provide events, etc., for people in DC more effectively going forward. So that's something that I'm particularly keen to build out.
Great. And Maureen, maybe this one can go to you. We have a question from a GS18 alum, Powell. Says, what can local elected officials, especially those of small towns and cities, do to address climate change?
I think a lot. I live in a small village that is on the Hudson River, and they have been doing coastal resiliency studies, trying to understand how to safely develop the town to deal with the rising level of the river. It's the Hudson River, so it's close enough to the ocean that the water's rising in our village as well. You can change building codes, local building codes. You can create recycling programs. I mean, I'm thinking of all the things that my local town is doing. And really engage and help educate the community on the problem as well. Bring speakers in, have civic and community events. So I have always told people that, you know, as an individual, educate yourself about climate change, then educate your family, then educate your neighbors and your community. And, you know, if we just all pull in the same direction, I think we'll get there.
I think that's a great point. And it's really not just, you know, from the country level, it has to be up and down, kind of everybody doing their part. Joshua Spodek says that leadership is really important, and people, communities, nations have to change their behavior to reduce pollution. And it's really around kind of culture and how do you change culture? So he says, does Columbia intend to help influence culture and behavior this way, or develop people to do that?
So maybe I could just dive in there. I mean, it's quite interesting because a lot of the young people are, as Mo said, are amazingly energized. I mean, it shouldn't be surprising. So we did town halls with the students when we were talking about the climate school, but also at Lamont, there's phenomenal engagement and enthusiasm around these issues. So I remember having one conversation with somebody who was actually leaving Lamont and heading off somewhere back to Europe. And she said to me, you know, one of the things that is of concern is how do you build leadership in this area? So it's fine to actually provide, you know, expertise in things like, you know, glaciology or whatever it is, or climate law, but how do you train people in leadership? And this is massively important. So I think there are two aspects. One is we need to build communication. We need to actually figure out how to communicate with people better and more effectively and confront the challenges that we face today in society around communication. But the other is, how do you actually, as an individual, build your own ability to operate as a leader in society? And it can be, as you know from social media these days, brutal. I mean, it can be really hard as a young person trying to, you know, argue your way about the importance of the environment and sustainability at the same time as you're getting abused online by people who disagree with you. And so that's quite a, you know, and it probably is different for different kinds of people. But for many people, that must be quite intimidating and difficult when actually we need leadership and we need people to actually give voice to their concerns and feel emboldened to influence what's going on and actually take up roles in society in terms of local leadership in particular.
we had a comment come in as we were speaking about that they said, don't forget the arts. And, you know, that really kind of touches on how we feel, not just how we think, and that can really affect whether we're willing to believe it or not. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Can I just quickly say something there? That's another reason why New York is the greatest place. I mean, it's like fantastic for the arts. So we've started discussions with the Shed and with Carnegie Hall about what we can do together. And of course, Carol Becker, who's Dean of the Arts, is deeply engaged with this, and she's passionate about the environment, and she's been doing that through some of her exhibitions. And those people are really, really keen, those people she brings in are really keen to work with us in the climate school. So we've got some phenomenal people interested in that whole thing. And I think even people in the music department are keen to actually engage with us on the climate school. So that is hugely important, because people need to be able to, at some level, express their feelings and their thoughts about what's happening to their planet. And this is a massively important issue. There should be much more writing and music and drama and movies, etc., about what's happening to the planet right now. It's so important, and we should be encouraging people to think about how to do that.
Maybe taking up to the 20,000-foot view, looking at kind of climate. L. Nelson says that national prosperity can be tied almost directly to access to energy. And obviously the easiest access to energy is fossil fuels. So if the Western countries decide to clamp down on fossil fuels, how might that affect the prosperity and prospects for underdeveloped countries? And I'll just add, with COVID, we're seeing inequalities really go up both between countries and within countries. So is that going to impact recovery as we try and think about our fossil fuel reduction or not?
So I'll weigh in on there, because I do have a little bit of a strong feeling on this. So the access to energy is needed. We need to change the type of energy we're accessing to renewable energy or non-carbon based energy. But I also think it's a little bit of a fallacy about, to speak of underdeveloped countries. They should all have a right to get to, a minimal level of, food security, home security, medical security, education, and all these things. But in terms of the first world and like Europe and the US, well, I'll just talk about the US. We have way more stuff than we need. I mean, it's like, I think that we need to have a little bit of a sea change in the level of consumerism. And again, this is another thing that I think hopefully maybe this year has made us all realize maybe we don't need to shop quite so much or need to buy quite so much. But they always, they say that the more you gain, it doesn't increase your happiness in life. So, after a certain point, once you have, all your basic needs met. But climate change is, I think there was just a paper that came out in Nature that said there's more stuff on the planet now made by humans than all the natural things, plants and animals on planet. So there's now more human-made stuff on the planet than natural stuff. And that's phenomenal when you think about it.
Yeah.
Too much stuff.
Unfortunately, I feel like so many of us are at home just ordering more and more because we can't go anywhere. I know I get a lot of packages, which is not helping.
Yeah, I'm no saint on that regard. I hear you, but
I think there is an important issue though with really impoverished communities that actually do need the jobs and the money and everything that comes from and the energy that's cheap to actually survive. And so I do think that has got to be part of the solution, is providing opportunities for them going forward and actually getting them to understand that actually they will benefit. And so I think that's one of the toughest problems, actually.
And kind of staying big level with the US and Europe, let's say that we did manage to reduce greenhouse gases from the US, Europe, but China and India don't. Would our reduction be sufficient?
No.
No, definitely not.
But the other thing is, I think it's important for people to realize that a lot of China's emissions, they're making the stuff we buy, right? So, because manufacturing's cheap there. So it's like it's really, I think it's kind of a fool's errand to say China emission, you know, we all own all the emissions. We're all connected in so many ways, many we don't even realize.
Yeah. And I think that, I mean, actually, and how you do your carbon accounting in that respect is really important. And so I think that's to some extent what the, you know, the European Green Deal is trying to address, but also I think that, you know, businesses are going to have to, and finance institutions are going to have to think hard about how far down they actually take that way of accounting in terms of carbon footprint. And you know, there's no question we've actually need to, in terms of trying to decarbonize around the world, there's tons of hypocrisy being spoken about it. I mean, we're full of it, you know. And so, and a lot of our carbon emissions to some extent are to do with maybe the decline in manufacturing in our country, and actually because we're actually buying the stuff that's being made elsewhere, as Mo said. But it's also there in China. I mean, China is actually, you know, decarbonizing a lot of its power, mainly because of pollution and the effect it's having on their community. At the same time as they're building coal-powered fire stations, power stations for the communities elsewhere in the world as part of their Belt and Road initiative. So you just say this is, you know, the drivers are somewhat different for different countries. And I think there's plenty to be concerned about in terms of how seriously people are going to take these limits, and not enough is being done. It's pretty clear the current agreements that are in place are woefully insufficient for what we need for the future.
Right. So I wonder if you think, even with all the changes that are going on, say the U.S. rejoins the Paris Climate Accords, and we reduce emissions, we switch over to new, greener technologies, electric vehicles, but mining for critical minerals that are used in those green technologies is quite bad for the environment. So even if we do kind of all of these switches, do you think that we can do enough to kind of save our planet long term?
So I think that's a really important problem. So, and the whole issue of resources and where we get them from and what kind we need and how can we do it. Like at the moment, we're sort of starting to mine the ocean floor, and it started already in certain parts of the surface of the Earth. And, you know, there are agreements about what can be done and what can't be done at some level, but it's not something that's been well understood. And at the same time, we don't actually understand what mining the ocean floor really does to the ocean. I mean, there are metalliferous deposits there that are accumulating at the rate of 1 millimeter per million years. And because the ocean floor has been, you know, quiet and separated from the rest of the planet, gradually they've been accumulating these metals on the bottom of the ocean floor. But nobody's asked, you know, really studied what happens if you start just going down there, digging it all up and messing up the ocean chemistry in the process. What does it do to the biosphere? What does it do to food chains? And there are massive issues there to get sorted out to make sure that in the process of, you know, tearing up the ocean, we don't actually damage the food chains upon which we depend going forward. There's more we could say about that. So.
I'm optimistic. I have great faith in the ingenuity of humans. And I think another thing that's been really inspiring is the increasing, I mean, humans need to fundamentally change their relationship with nature, right? Don't look at it as to serve us, but to live in harmony and sustainably with nature. And one of the things that's really interesting, I think, is the increasing focus on the relationships that indigenous communities have had with their environment for thousands of years, and the indigenous knowledge that surrounds those relationships that have sustained their nature and their communities for so long. So maybe there'll be a lot more scholarly inquiry into those realms in collaboration with those communities.
Great. So we have a few more questions about the school itself. So I'm going to kind of pivot back to that. I will just say that the recording will be available on the ColumbiaDC YouTube page. So if you just search YouTube for us, you'll find all of our previous programming from this year. And I'll also send out an email probably tomorrow after the video is done rendering. But Megan says that the Climate and Society program is the inaugural program in the climate school. And she's a C&S 2011 alumna, asks if you can speak to how the Climate and Society program has evolved over the last 10 years and what we've learned that has influenced how the program is presented now.
So I should know more about this than I do, but I'm fairly new to the Earth Institute, so I don't know enough about how that has evolved over time. But I think what was important about the Climate and Society program and why it started is because a brilliant scientist at Lamont, Mark Kane, and his students basically figured out how to predict El Nino, how to make predictions of what would happen around the planet. And this was an amazing piece of geosciences. Brilliant. He's won many medals and awards for it. And at the same time, Mark realized that this would have profound significance for society, and that actually we should set up something that would actually work to benefit society and actually take our understanding of climatic variability, as happens with things like El Nino, and deliver advice to various governments about what will be happening to their crops next year, or what they should think about in terms of worrying about storm damage or whatever. So that's why the International Research Institute for Climate and Society was established, which is a really powerful organization that the university, Lee Bollinger's first Columbia World Projects, has taken advantage of IRI and what it's doing to build out this program Act Today, which is amazingly providing detailed advice to governments around the world about how they can interpret their own meteorological records and figure out how to think about food security going forward in their own countries. And that needs scaling up tremendously. But it's a classic example of what the Earth Institute and Columbia can deliver, which actually takes science, top quality science, and actually delivers it to people in terms of their needs for society, in their own societies going forward. And the Climate Society Master's Program was built upon that idea. It's housed in a science department, but it's an MA. And it's meant to be a mixture of both natural sciences and social sciences. Going forward, we're probably going to expand it somewhat in terms of its footprint and build out different options going forward. But we're also thinking about maybe building another master's program that'll be different again. We don't know at the moment. We're looking at the details. So I think the kinds of areas that we think you need to be thinking about in terms of areas that are really important are going to involve areas like health and climate, understanding economics and finance in the context of climate, understanding law and governance, and people's human rights and climate. And many of these fields, like I said earlier, are relatively new. They're not really developed at the level they need to be. And increasingly people are realizing they need to have climate embedded in a lot of these subjects going forward. So I suspect the way climate and society is going is that actually there's going to be a greater range of possibilities in terms of options of areas you can get into. And if that doesn't work within the Climate and Society program, which is a 12-month program, then we're going to have to think about offering other master's programs that we could run in parallel to actually try and achieve that breadth. But climate is going to be so critical for everybody. You know, all walks of life are going to actually need to understand how climate is going to interface with, or maybe interfere with what they're doing. And so that's why that kind of program and those kinds of programs going forward are going to be really important.
And maybe if I can just stay with you for one more question. You mentioned that there's going to be a new building for the climate school. has there been any specific consideration given on how the building can be an example with green certifications, energy, water, waste tracking, benchmarking, kind of best practices?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. So yes, I've been just talking to the architects today. So we are planning, there's a site on the Manhattanville campus that we're thinking of building out a building. We're not sure how much we will need. It was originally designed for a much bigger building, but we think we can actually use a part of that space and then build it out as the school expands over the next 10 years. So this is going to be expensive. Building a school is not cheap. And building a school where you want to try and provide as much as possible in terms of underpinning resource is going to require a lot of donations and support from different people. People typically don't go into climate thinking they want to make a lot of money, although some people will, I'm sure. And so we're conscious of the fact that many of these students are going to need support as part of the climate school. So this is all going to cost money. The building we're looking to build, we've discussed with Renzo Piano, the architect, who has already designed a couple of the buildings on Manhattanville and also came up with a master plan for Manhattanville. And I went over with Lee Bollinger, the president, in January to Paris and met up with Renzo and his team in their studio. And from the get-go, we said this has got to be a carbon neutral building. It's got to be world leading in terms of what it can achieve. And Renzo, as you know, is one of the most innovative, and his team are amongst the most innovative building designers in the world, architects. And they really want to make this building amazing in terms of what it will be able to achieve, both in terms of being a green building, carbon neutral, but also in terms of the kinds of statements it will make about the environment and sustainability. And it ties into a broader strategy that we have for Columbia, and that is that we need to get on and start thinking about how can we change our own practices within Columbia University. And the president is totally on board with this and leading on it. And so there will be a lot of changes, I think, going forward around how we actually think about the campus, how we change the way we do things and improve things in a way that's better for the environment and more sustainable. And the final thing to say about that is we have an amazing School of Architecture and Planning at Columbia. And there's quite a strong focus on how do you build sustainability and energy efficiency into building design going forward. And so this is going to be quite a key part for that school as well. And they're going to engage with us as we think about the campus. And then, of course, the students themselves across Columbia really care about this issue, regardless of what discipline they're in. And so I think engaging the students and actually even thinking about the campus as a living laboratory is a great opportunity. Lamont has already been moving in this direction. It's been doing fantastic work in terms of getting solar power for much of its energy needs, and is also already thinking about what it needs to do next in terms of the next building that needs to go up and how to make it a much more sustainable design. So we're
Carbon zero.
Yeah.
And one quick question, if the DEES PhD program will be transferred to the climate school?
The DEES PhD program it's part of arts and sciences, of course. The climate school will be setting up as a separate school. And I think at the moment, what we've been doing is, DEES is sort of, all those faculty and students are at Lamont. And so there's an inextricable link between, DEES, Lamont, and the climate school. It's all kind of connected. So even though the governance is kind of complicated, or it is at the moment, the fact is that we are deeply committed to closely aligning our discussions and our strategy and our plans with those that are coming out of DEES, and we want them to feel that the climate school is for them, and this is part of this is an opportunity for them, just as much as as perhaps potentially more so than many other departments, because of that very, very close, intimate relationship we've got. And they've got lots of great ideas. So
And Maureen, we have a question. I wonder if you can come up with any specific private sector companies that might be interested in hiring climate school graduates. Like, where can they go into the private sector?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I actually suspect Alex has done more research on this than I have, but what I'm seeing is an increasing number of companies that want to have climate compliance type officers. Like, how can we lower our carbon footprint in our company? How can we make our products more climate friendly? But do I know any specific companies? No, not offhand. Alex, do you know, have you I know you did some research on this last year with the committee.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's, again, there's going to be a ton of opportunity here across the spectrum. So if you think about, if you're interested in the issue of food supply and food security and food, you need to worry about climate change. And so there's no question that the whole food sector, which is a massive part of the R&D and as well as the GDP of many countries, is, you know, that's going to be a really important component, and they're going to need climate expertise in those areas. If you look at the finance sector, they need it in spades right now, because they're actually thinking hard about how do they actually predict the future going forward, and what do they do about investments in certain areas. But, you know, the other thing that's important is that, you know, the oil and gas industry, we're going to need them to be part of the solution to the climate problem, because we've got to bury a load of carbon underground, and Lamont's been doing brilliant work in this area. And so working with those oil and gas companies so that they feel they're part of the solution could be an immensely helpful way of taking the whole thing forward. And there'll be a lot of need for expertise in those areas. So I think there's, you know, variety of different kinds of companies have already expressed lots of interest going forward. I think the trick is to pick out which ones are just doing lip service and which ones are really seriously engaged in embracing the need to change society in this way. And because a lot of them will actually come up with, you know, what they think are quite effective comments and statements about what they think the world wants them to say, but actually, are they really changing the way they're doing things? And I think that's going to take, that takes a bit of scrutiny.
Can I just mention a couple that come to mind? So areas that companies have a tremendously growing need to understand climate risk and extreme weather related risk. So companies like Jupiter Intelligence is hiring people like crazy. They've been scooping people up from NOAA. They've been scooping people up from science disciplines. Yeah.
Yep.
Elsewhere, Descartes Labs, which is in New Mexico, good place to live. It's beautiful down there, but they do all sorts of really interesting data crunching for the good of the world, as well as to make a profit. I would say, like, of the oil companies, Total and Shell especially are hiring climate folks. And then, like, back when I was in climate and society, it was really like the Re's. It was like Munich Re and Swiss Re, and like the insurance sector or government. And now it's entire companies that are popping up because everybody needs to figure out what is their risk, what is their exposure to sea level rise or heat waves, or etc. So just to name a couple like specific ones.
Yeah, they're funding a lot of research at Lamont for, you know, and also, you know, bathymetric surveys for offshore wind, all kinds of things is going on.
We did a study a year ago. We did a study, or got someone else to do a study for us, a consultancy firm, to take a look at what was happening in terms of demand for climate expertise. And you can get it at some level just from LinkedIn, and actually looking at the changes in the number of times climate crops up as a phrase in people's, you know, how they describe themselves and their expertise, and how that's changing over time. And it's a significant increase over time, you know, several percent, you know, of increase every year. in terms of the uptake of climate as a phrase that people are using in their CVs to try and talk about their expertise. So people realize, and it's right there at the executive level. So I think there's increasing awareness that they need these areas of expertise, this area of expertise.
This is Kambiz Ranawadi. Thanks so much. We're going to close now because we still have some questions coming in, but we ran out of time. I just want to, sincerely thank all of you for being here. Please consider us as your extended arm in the national capital, and to bring your message to DC and any other need, communication need that you have. As Miyako mentioned, the recording for this session will be posted and emailed to everyone within 24 hours. And we will add some resources from Lamont and Earth Institute if anybody is interested in collaborate with the school. If there is no final comment, any final comments that you may want to add?
I just want to say thank you, all of you. It's great to have your interest, and we're keen to connect and engage with our alums. And I think we would see you as an important resource for us, and I hope you can feel connected with us and supported by us as you carry on with your lives, having started in this great university.
I'll second that. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak, and it's a pleasure to be here.
And thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone. I see you at the next event. Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.